Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Braves of Five podcast. I'm once again joined by Keith, Alec, and Florian. So, what's ironic about today's episode is about 2 weeks ago, Florian and I did a video on anarcho-tyranny, terrorism, where we talked about events like this well before Charlie Kirk was actually assassinated. And we'd already planned this we plan our roundtables at a minimum 2 weeks in advance, sometimes even a month or two. So, this was already planned. So, of course, I just changed the title a little bit to incorporate the recent events that happened, which really vindicates the thought processes on this panel here of our deciding for content. That, we're really at the cutting edge of what's going on. So, I'm going to begin with a prepared presentation, then I'll hand it off to the rest of you guys. Little did I know when I planned this episode 2 weeks ago how apropos this would be. Let's begin with describing the threat environment. The toxic media and propaganda landscape with voices demanding direct and even violent action, we have the preconditions for stochastic terrorism. A historical example would be Henry II when he said about Thomas Becket, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" This was taken as a green light by certain knights to kill Becket. This environment is dangerous in that it leaves the heat turned up to max with very limited liability and responsibility for the speakers, sort of like crying fire in a crowded theater. Federal handlers of operatives, for example, there's a joke on the right that the KKK is all feds. Many of the Occupy movement also claimed agent provocateurs undermined their cause. So we have the first group would be the lone wolves that are conditioned by the stochastic terrorism to attack. And then we have the patsies, those people who are controlled by handlers. And then the last group is what I would call the jackals from John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. These are the professional killers who spread terror and initiate regime change. With regards to political violence, suspects can fall into one of these three categories. Now, as to motives for any given number of these people, excluding jackals, the way capitalism hides social relations, it makes it hard for everybody to see which moving parts affect which people, especially economically disadvantaged people. This group is at risk of being either a lone wolf or a patsy as they see no other way to get their grievances redressed. The real question we have to ask is why this? Why do all these political violence begin after the formation of the U.S. security state apparatus? This wasn't happening, say, in 1910. Really gets you thinking. The situation is this. The international order of finance capital and the military-industrial complex is in crisis. To shore up control at home, the elites seek to generate conflict that is horizontal rather than vertical. Left v. right rather than bottom v. top. This is done by stoking the propaganda landscape and use of agent provocateurs to stir up horizontal violence. Caleb Maupin sees this as an intra-elite conflict in the U.S. with an effort to stimulate something like the years of lead, a time of political violence in Italy. This can be seen as fitting into a broader policy of imploding economies and nations as described by John Perkins. These tactics are being used at home that were first pioneered and perfected abroad. Charlie Kirk's assassination is best understood when placed in this framework of a threat environment. Initial official reports were that the shooter was affiliated with Antifa, making notice of anti-fascist and transgender symbolism with the rifle and cartridges which were found. I was immediately suspicious as this does not fit the trans shooter profile as seen in 2023 Nashville shooting and the 2025 Minneapolis shooting. The profile of a trans shooter is mentally unwell, indiscriminate violence, murder-suicide, and a written suicide note explaining their motives. None of this fits the profile for the Kirk shooter, who was precise, got away, and didn't leave any explanation for why he did what he did. Furthermore, the shot looked like a pro, not some unstable person. I'm hearing conflicting reports today about the suspect, Tyler Robinson, that he was a conservative and affiliated with the Groypers in order to discredit Nick Fuentes. And we'll get into some more of these theories later, but the one that I find interesting is one I first heard proposed by Harrison Smith from InfoWars. The day of the shooting, and today by Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone, that somebody close to Kirk told them he was afraid of pressure from Israel. Whether this is one person or two, as Harrison Smith says, that it either could be the same guy that he is referring to or some other person, anonymous tip-off, tweeted about today is unknown. Candace Owen, along with Jackson Hinkle, have all been pointing the finger at Israel as well. The telling thing about this is that depending on how one reacts to the Kirk shooting, it stokes the flames of horizontal rather than vertical violence. Cui bono. This attack, I argue, is a form of kinetic psychological warfare. It is kinetic in that the violent force was used, but the death of Charlie Kirk was a means to a broader end to psychologically activate people. The left and the right were targets, their minds. Depending on how one reacted, it shows what is really laying beneath the surface. Let's take a step back here. There is a very elementary distinction that needs to be made that nobody's making. The last time we saw political violence at these levels was in the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War. The difference is a bunch of good old boys shooting the town up in Bleeding Kansas is a world apart from political violence that is directly stimulated by the national security state to maintain control. These tensions that are ripping the nation apart are all constructed fabrications rooted in the culture war, which is a frozen conflict led by countergangs. Without this apparatus rooted in financial and security state apparatuses, this would not be happening. These conditions are stimulated, not the result of real and organic processes. As long as the bankers' consolidation of 1913 and the military consolidation after 1945 is left unchallenged, I see no reason to think this kind of action will cease. Caleb Maupin, in his Bread Tube Serves Imperialism, makes the compelling case that much of the modern left is synthetic and in the spook sphere. As long as the apparatus of the national security state exists to keep artificially stimulating violence, I don't see these things quieting down. The death of Charlie Kirk shattered many narratives. We are approaching a point in which most people not have any idea what is going on, as their preconceived notions are shattered to pieces on the floor. The effect is to have the oxygen drained out of the room. All right, Keith, you first. Do you want me to share that spreadsheet you got?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, we still don't really know what happened as far as the murder of Charlie Kirk. When I saw the shooting, it looked like a professional hit. It looked like something that somebody who was an expert marksman would do. The suspect that was apprehended, I don't know if he would qualify as an expert marksman. He comes from rural small town Utah, from at least according to what they're telling us. And that's part of gun culture is pervasive there. So maybe he's just good with guns. But the shooting itself did look like a professional level hit. And my first thought is that there were others involved than just simply the standard narrative about some random lone nut shooter or some fringe political tendency. Perhaps intelligence was involved, perhaps foreign intelligence was involved, but we don't really know. And so who knows what happened? No, we don't have enough information. But what I think is interesting about this is that as Todd is showing on the screen, I did just a basic AI query about incidents of political violence in the United States since 2015. And I asked AI to create a list of this type. And what I found was a fairly significant number of incidents of this type, at least about half a dozen major incidents each year for the last 10 years or so, including stuff we're familiar with, for example, the Charlottesville in 2017 and the attempt on President Trump last year. But it also looks like it's escalated over time. For example, the number of examples given for this year, 2025, are about twice anything that happened in the previous years. And also, it's not an exhaustive list. I know of other incidents that aren't even listed on here. For example, there was the guy who was stalking President Trump at a golf course not long ago, who was apparently upset about Trump's Ukraine policy. There was a case in Virginia recently, in Danville, Virginia, where somebody attacked a city councilman and set him on fire. I'm not sure what the motives for that were, whether it was political or just some crazy person doing a crazy thing. But we do see plenty of examples of attacks on public officials, violence between rival political groups, attacks on something that represents some opposing political team. For example, we saw the assassination of the embassy workers at the Israeli embassy. There was some other attack on pro-Israel marchers. I think it was in Colorado a while back. We also saw attacks on pro-Palestinian protesters in New York. And it looks like that the amount of political violence in the United States is escalating. Now, there's a big debate between different sides as to who is most responsible. One narrative you get from the right or the conservative side is that, well, leftist violence is all over the place, and they'll cite things like riots in 2020 or riots on college campuses and things like that. The other side, the left, will say, well, no, actually, the majority of political violence comes from white supremacists and groups like that. And they'll talk about the killing of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville. They'll talk about somebody somewhere shooting at a synagogue or something like that. But whatever, whoever is most to blame, this list alone shows there's a whole lot of different types of people that are involved in this kind of violence. And as far as comparing it to different time periods in American history, like Todd was doing, in some ways it's similar to the 1960s because there was a lot of that kind of stuff in the 60s as well. You had terrorist bombings by groups like the Weathermen. You also had the assassination of civil rights figures by the KKK and groups like that. But at the same time, the American ruling class itself was more unified and more stable during that time period. And the United States was unquestionably the most powerful nation in the world, even with competition from the Soviet Union. And also, there was more of a majoritarian culture then than there is now. You had a situation in the 60s where radicals were pushing out against the mainstream society. It wasn't really a straight down the middle cultural divide like we see now. For instance, in 1972, Nixon won re-election with 49 out of 50 states. And George McGovern, who represented the New Left, only won the Massachusetts, which was at the time the most left-leaning state in the United States. Nowadays, it's a much different situation. We have a much more divided ruling class. The United States is retreating internationally as a major world power. I mean, the United States is still the largest world power, but it's getting to be more like the year, say, 1900, where the British Empire was still the biggest player on the field, but was being challenged by a whole lot of other rising forces. And also culturally, we have, I don't know if it's an even split, it depends on how you gauge all that, but the cultural divisions in the United States are much more factionalized and much broader. There's much less of a unitary American culture and more of a whole lot of different subcultures and political factions that are competitors to each other. And as far as time periods from the United States that this most resembles, I think the lead up to the Civil War is certainly one. I think there are problems, though, with the Civil War analogy because the pre-Civil War era, in my view, is that what ultimately caused the Civil War was irreconcilable differences within the ruling class over what politico-economic model was going to dominate the westward expansion. That was during Manifest Destiny and the westward expansion. And you had the northern and southern factions of the U.S. ruling class, both wanting their models to dominate the West and therefore eventually the whole United States. The North wanted industrial capitalism with wage labor, the British German model. The South wanted a more primitive form of agricultural capitalism with shadow labor. And these were irreconcilable systems, and one had to yield to the other. The North ultimately won. I don't know that our ruling class today is that divided, where it's that level of an existential divide. I think there's certainly divisions, but it's not quite that extreme. I think it's probably closer to the age of acrimony in the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, you had sharp class divisions coming out of the Industrial Revolution. The remnants of the conflict between the North and South were still pervasive. You had very rapid technological and economic and cultural change like you have now, and that created a lot of social dislocations and it created a lot of social conflict. You also had people who were zealous social reformers of different types. You also had reactionary movements that were for example, opposed to, say, immigration, just like we have now, even while there was also a lot of immigration going on. So I think right now, and I've said this in other streams, right now seems more analogous to the late 19th and early 20th century, both geopolitically, as well as within, as far as economically, as far as divisions within the ruling class, as far as on a socio-cultural conflict. And there was a lot of violence back then. Like if you look at the history of the labor movement in the United States, the labor movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century was extremely violent, and conflicts between labor unions and strike breakers and employer militias and the National Guard, police, and all that, extremely violent. There was also a lot of racial violence back then, the late 19th century. You had the Ku Klux Klan in the South in the post Civil War period. Then you also had the Second Klan in the 1920s. That was a mass organization, and you also, so you had a reactionary or right wing, but as conventionally understood, tendency as well. And I think that's kind of where we are now. It's almost like we're going back in time to the late 19th century. We're the period between the 1880s and the 1920s. Before we have the same level of wealth division that we have now between social classes. And I really think that's kind of where we are now. And all the violence that we're seeing that's politically motivated reflects that. It reflects this kind of fragmentation and instability.
Okay, Alec, your turn.
Well, I have a couple of things to say. From a purely historical perspective, we are in the fourth turn. Though Keith mentioned that the ethos, the zeitgeist, resembles the early 20th century or the late 19th century more so than, say, the 1930s. The previous fourth turn was in the 1930s and 40s when Giuseppe Zangara almost assassinated FDR. The fourth turn before that culminated in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So what is the fourth turn? Well, that's a well-known book by Neil Howe and William Strauss about the cyclical nature of the American history. The fourth turning is when our institutions are being remade to be something entirely different. The culture undergoes a fundamental change. Steve Bannon is a big proponent of that theory. And some may argue that the Trump administration is deliberately trying to accelerate the fourth turning. And we see accelerationism in some white nationalist cohorts, for example, who are trying to bring about a violent reshaping of society. That is certainly an element that is happening, that our society is now is fundamentally different from how it was in the early 2000s. Even when George Bush declared the Patriot Act and the surveillance powers of the NSA have been significantly expanded, the United States is still much more of a free market economy. We were in the third turn with individualism, individual rights, free markets, and of course the ideology of the self-made man. Nothing could be further from the truth. The American dream is dead, as Donald Trump proudly declares. And very few people still believe that today, that now it's as easy to start your own business in the United States or be successful, pull yourself up by the bootstraps as it used to be. So that is an unfortunate byproduct of the fourth turn, which usually means depression, civil war, all-out conflict, or at the very least a fundamental restructuring of every aspect of society, from our culture to institutions to our self-concept as individuals to the collective national American identity, which no longer exists, which is something we've discussed repeatedly on this channel. So it is to be expected that this process is meant to be bloodthirsty and fundamentally divisive. Now, that brings me to my second point. I will bring up the concept of Occam's razor and prune away all these far-reaching ideological speculations. As Todd, you said it yourself, that our conceptions of society are being shattered, that it's difficult to simplify this to a woke assassination attempt or white nationalist assassination attempt, as Keith has shown in the research that he has published here, that we cannot identify very clear and distinct ideological motives. Some of them come from the far left, others come from the far right. Maybe the shooter was woke, or maybe he was actually a staunch conservative conservative. Maybe he was neither. Maybe he was not ideological at all. These labels no longer serve any purpose. Now, what is more relevant, however, is the decline in mental state of our society. This did not quite exist in the last fourth term and during the Great Depression. If anything, it seems to me that the Great Depression has brought the country together. Hardship promoted solidarity. And for better or for worse, FDR with his fireside chats had a very persuasive show, which meant to unify the country. Now Donald Trump has had the opposite effect. We're seeing a very different kind of a fourth term, but the bigger point here is that social media has fostered social isolation. Social media seems to be acting as a replacement for real human interaction rather than a supplement to it. Now, when I was younger, back in 2004, 2005, when I graduated from high school, we used online messengers to meet up with people we knew. That was a supplement. Now social media is a replacement. And well, why does that matter? And what does that have to do with political violence? Well, mental illness seems to be driving political violence quite a bit. And while we do not know if the assassin of Charlie Kirk was mentally ill, Tyler Robinson, well, he may well be, but it wouldn't be surprising. We wouldn't put it past him, but at the very least, it sounds like he lived in his own ideological echo chamber, as very many young people do. What we do know about him, however, is that he only studied at the University of Utah for one semester. So it seems implausible that this assassination is a product of woke indoctrination. If anything, it seems to me that this is probably a result of his psychological state of being. And we do know that he's from a conservative Mormon family. And what's interesting about Utah is that this state is the biggest consumer of pornography, which is not surprising. That is something you often find in the most religious states in America, where pornography or any kind of sexuality is taboo. Now, it is plausible that given that he was a son of a pastor, or at least his family was deeply devout, that he faced significant pressure to conform to a strict conservative moral code. And it is to be expected that in this day and age, with so much mental illness and social media echo chamber, so much activity going on by way of social media echo chambers, that a young man will suffer from a mental breakdown. And that, to me, is the hypothesis that Occam's razor favors the most. Instead of focusing on the overarching ideological narratives, we need to accept that we're in the fourth term and that what made sense 10, 20 years ago no longer does. So we need to be careful about classifying people based on ideological motives, and let's look at the nitty-gritty details of these specific cases. Unfortunately, there is not enough information about the shooter, Tyler Robinson. We don't know if he had a mental disorder. We don't know if his family upbringing had something to do with this outcome, but that needs to be investigated on the deepest level possible. So the FBI, at the very least, can get better at identifying the profiles of these mass shooters. It seems to me that the profiles that worked previously no longer are effective at identifying potential suspects. For example, until very recently, almost all of the political assassinations were carried out by far-right white nationalist extremists, at least overwhelming majority. But as we now see in the document that Keith has shared, it's not so simple. So we need to begin fundamentally revamping the psychological profile of anybody who may be a mass shooter, and I think the best place to start would be social media, track their profiles. Maybe there will be an opportunity for big tech to investigate potential shooters in collaboration with the FBI.
All right, Florian.
Yeah, thanks everyone for their thoughts and ideas. I think when I thought about this, and also in light of anarcho-tyranny and stochastic terrorism, I think that stochastic terrorism is a way for the managerial and police class, if you want to call them that, to grab power. So basically, if you treat the police not as a bureaucracy, but like a social stratum with institutional interests, then they do act with a degree of autonomy, right? So they have police unions, lobbying organizations, professional associations. They push for legal structures, budgets, expanded authorities, serve their own institutional survival, right? That certainly places them in the managerial sphere for the not for the rank and file lieutenants on the street, but certainly on the police administration. And we talk about anarcho-terrorism or anarcho-tyranny, which basically means that the police will let perpetrators, criminals go, like the guy who stabbed Irina Zarustra in the subway or in the bus. He was like taken up 14 times and then let go every time again. But if people try to defend themselves from criminals, then they get the full force of the law. We saw that with Daniel Penny in the subway, right? So this is basically one way that police class can increase their power, right? And stochastic terrorism is another power vehicle for the police, right? So high-profile incident that justifies heightened police presence, expanded counterterrorism powers, Palantir integration, AI integration into police, and so on. And then everyone doesn't know like who will strike next, and that creates security premium. That means society tolerates more discretionary police power, right? So both anarcho-tyranny, stochastic terrorism can serve like I would say like elite theorists may call them narratives of crisis, right? And so basically they justify the expansion of police power. And now you can say, well, but the ruling class they still hold the purse strings, right? They can still hire and fire people. They still have to acknowledge the budget. They still have to give them the money. But the police has become such a vast managerial apparatus that, and also other forces like ATF, they have tanks now. They have them since the 1990s when we saw that in Waco, right? So why does the ATF and why the DA, why do they have tanks and why do they have military gear? This seems more and more like its own class and their own structure. And if you think about a big bureaucracy as some form of like an ocean liner that goes its way, and when you want to change direction of that ocean liner, it's almost impossible to do immediately. You can only do it very slowly. And I think that's where we are with the FBI as a managerial class. They have their own power. Plus, they will also justify more funds by managing crime. That goes back to stochastic terrorism and narco-tyranny. Just as pharmaceutical companies are not interested in a cure, they want to manage. They would want to keep people sick and then manage them. And other institutions, they try to manage a problem, like homelessness organizations. They don't really work in making people in housing people. Yeah, they just basically serve to increase their power, while tent cities are also increasing, right? They're managing the problem. Everything in society is managed, and so that gives you that can become very cumbersome, but it can also be dangerous if this management mentality comes to the police. And there's certain certain evidence that you could put forth for that. Like some of you have already mentioned that, right? So you have the shooting. So first of all, Charles Manson is an example of stochastic terrorism. So basically, he was egged on by the CIA, and basically he said he wasn't. Prosecutors back then, after the murders of the Manson families, they put this helter-skelter theory forward. So Manson had given the order, but he never really gave the order. He just created an atmosphere where his followers then at one point acted, right? Like Todd mentioned in the very beginning. Won't someone take action already? And then somebody does, right? And then what you also have, what Keith said, is back in the 70s, we had KKK and Weatherman violence, but the ruling class was more stable and unified. Now we have a less stable, unified ruling class, and that means there's sort of a power vacuum where an expanded FBI, for example, could go in, right? So they could emerge as a new quasi-ruling class, right? And non-coincidentally, that all happens since we have more police state. That's also something that Todd mentioned in the beginning, and Keith also alluded to that. So, who indoctrinated the shooter? If it really was Tyler Robinson, which I believe is true, who indoctrinated? Maybe not his teachers or his university professors, but he was active on Discord server and Reddit forums and so on. And I don't want to blame, put my finger at, the evil online world, they corrupt the youth. No, but you really have some players on these servers that egg people on. By the way, another way for the police to foment stochastic terrorism, right? So you basically find gullible people, and then you kind of insinuate things, and somebody takes up the mantle, right? So in that case, I would be really interested in seeing the Discord server chat logs published, right, by our government, since that is where Tyler Robinson got his instructions, at least, right? There was one guy, I think, that was a co-conspirator. So that basically he hid the gun somewhere, and then Tyler would grab it. And Tyler could have been. I mean, the attacker could have been a trained marksman, but as Keith also said, some good old country boys, they are trained in shooting. And if you see the video from someone who was actually Tyler Robinson coming down from the roof, that after he shot Charlie, that doesn't seem to be very professional. Like, he kind of jumped and then he fell on his ankle and then he kind of limped through the neighborhood. It aligns with what I would say like a good old country boy going trans or going Antifa. His family said he was espousing a lot of hatred towards right wingers, especially Charlie Kirk. And then at one point, maybe he was unstable enough to say, let's go, right? So then I think the FBI does foment this stochastic terrorism, and I think the blood is on the FBI's hand and some of the left-wing organizations within the ruling class, maybe like the Soros guys and so on, who egg this on via the media. And when Alexei was talking about mental illness, there was a recent video by Master Chin or Justin Garcia, who had the Pressure Project podcast in the beginning. He talked about 3 cases of mental illness. One is the people that are really just mentally ill, right? They can be diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. They are really biologically ill. And then there is circumstantial mental illness, where someone does things he would normally not do. Like the husband comes home and sees his wife in bed with another man, he grabs a gun and kills everyone. And he would normally not do that. That's circumstantial mental illness. And then there's cultural mental illness. There's certain way of society, a way of people to behave that they wouldn't survive like that in the wild, right? It's a dysfunctional society. Like the entire trans movement and the entire DEI and all that kind of stuff, all what these leftist people are espousing, and some of the right-wing people as well, they wouldn't be able to survive in the wild with those ideas, right? It's a very dysfunctional way, and it's kind of like a cultural mental illness. And I think that fits into an overall stochastic terrorism atmosphere. And then I think the FBI and some other ruling class factions are part of that. And for the FBI and ATF and other police forces, this is a good opportunity to increase their power. And it's important for us to realize that attacks like on Charlie Kirk and other attacks, there will be more in the future. It's more like a feedback mechanism on a society that has become more and more mad. One last word to whether it's violence from the right or the left. I think most, especially people that were MAGA and on the right, starting in 2015, we couldn't really say.
Oh, Florian, we lost you. Florian. Okay, let's see here. We lost him again. What we're going to do is we're going to remove him from the stream for a moment and just tell him we lost him, and I'll. Okay. While we're doing that, we did get a super chat from Middleton Whitaker for $19.99. Thank you very much. Several pennies for your thoughts. Okay, and one more thing. We're going to. Okay. Hold on. Okay. So while we're waiting for Florian to get that taken care of, where we're at is really a kind of Baudrillard moment. So in Simulacra Simulation, pages 16 and 17, he says this, and this is so relevant to today. Is any given bombing in Italy the work of leftist extremists or extreme right provocation or a centrist mise-en-scene to discredit all extreme terrorists and to shore up its own failing power? Or again, is it a police-inspired scenario in a form of blackmail to public security? All of this is simultaneously true, and the search for proof, indeed the objectivity of the facts, does not put an end to this vertigo of interpretation. That is, we are in the logic of simulation, which no longer has anything to do with logic of facts and an order of reason. Simulation is characterized by precision of the model. Of all the models based on the merest fact, the models come first, their circulation orbital like that of the bomb constitutes the genuine magnetic field of events. The facts no longer have a specific trajectory. They are born at the intersection of models. A single fact can be engendered by all the models at once. So, okay, we think, Florian, we get you back? You're still muted.
How about now?
Okay, you're back. Why don't you just wrap up your final thoughts? Or your thoughts on that introduction, I mean.
Well, my thoughts are that stochastic terrorism and narco-tyranny are a way for the managerial class, especially in the form of the national police, to grab power and basically to fill out the power vacuum that offers itself up by a more disunity among the ruling class. And the FBI went to Discord servers and egged people on. So that's one way in which they could have indoctrinated Tyler Robinson.
Yeah, I agree. The whole Discord angle has been explored in other cases. But with regards to the fact that everything about this whole thing is very suspicious, right? Because on day one, they claimed that they had arrested 2 suspects and then released them. And then the day after, they said that this guy was probably Antifa or trans adjacent because of certain material that was associated with them. And now we're seeing official outlets saying that he's associated with the Groypers. I saw Nick Fuentes tweeting about that today. I'm like, nobody who's prosecuting this seems to know what they're doing. Who is this guy? What are his motives? And then, of course, there's from these anonymous tips, like I mentioned in my introductory statement, Harrison Smith and Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone claim that Charlie was afraid of some blowback from Israel. And some videos have been making the rounds where he was interviewed by Ben Shapiro and said some things. And there was also the 4-second clip of him getting shot that we've all seen. There was a slightly longer 8-second clip. Instead of a head-on shot, it was from the side. And it shows a guy behind him with a baseball cap, wiggling it like he's signaling to someone. Very strange. And the other thing is, I agree with Keith on this. This hit looks like a professional, right? It looks like a guy who knows what he's doing. And I don't see Tyler Robinson as that kind of guy. I mean, it is true. You could say that some good old boy just growing up shooting can be a crack shot. Think of like, some of the Americans in World War I who just grew up, shooting turkeys and then were crack shots in Europe. But again, what's the motive? I don't see a motive here. I don't see what this motive could be. And the initial motive, they can't seem to agree on because it's trans, then it's a groyper. I don't know which, those are 2 mutually exclusive explanations, both of which the MSM has been pushing. So, while, like I said, it's a Baudrillard moment, we don't really know who is behind it, I don't think. And I'm not even sure I trust the media to be honest about Tyler Robinson. But what we do know is what it does. What's the effect of all this? Well, one effect is to raise the temperature in the room and get both sides riled up. That serves a certain interest. I think we know what that interest is. It also shatters perceived notions, right? Where people are like, for example, Mike Rowe, the Dirty Jobs guy, when he covered this, he was just speechless. The guy was just stunned into silence. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say. And so part of that too is shattering consensus beliefs and leaving people stunned and dazed, right? Kinetic psychological warfare. And so that's another effect of all this. And I think those are the two main effects, right? Stimulating horizontal violence, and then also stunning people into silence because they just can't comprehend what happened and why. And that's only compounded by the contradictory reporting that we're getting from the MSM. So I think, if we're going to go with the thing is what a thing does, it sort of does glow in the dark. Keith.
According to the most recent news reports I'm seeing, it's being claimed that Tyler Robinson's roommate turned him in. Apparently, there's this fellow named Lance that was the roommate of Tyler. And apparently, the claim that being made is that Lance contacted the police or the FBI or someone about text messages or other information that he had about Tyler being the shooter. I've also seen the video of the man in the white outfit flashing something that looks kind of like hand circles, and I've seen other speculation about, what was that part of a plot or something. I've also seen it claimed that the identity of that person is actually Frank Turek. He is some sort of internet preacher that has sort of like a Christian type channel, so it's kind of a religious right type of figure, broadly defined, that was aligned with Charlie. So it's unlikely somebody like that would have a deep grudge against Charlie or want him killed, but that's just another thing that's out there floating around. One thing that I am seeing is that a lot of the people who do these kinds of crimes seem to be relatively young people most of the time. And they seem to be immersed in some of these online subcultures. And I'm inclined to think that that's being exploited by other forces. There are reasons why various intelligence services around the world would want to try to fuel that. First of all, in our own country, as Florin was describing, you have deep state elements that benefit from social division and conflict. And Caleb Malton has written about that recently in his book, The Years of Lead. Todd alluded to that as well. Also, we have a highly divided ruling class, so I don't know that there's any singular, systemic plot of that type. If there is one, there could be multiple sectors of the deep state or ruling class or whatever you want to call it. For instance, Florian was pointing out how the liberal or Democratic Party, or I would say transatlantic finance capital wing of the ruling class, has been trying to weaponize the FBI and some federal law enforcement agencies against their political opponents. And now we see the other side, the Trump side, or what I would call, Sunbelt capital and the upper levels of new capital, doing that with the immigration police and drastically expanding the immigration police, the ICE and all of that, possibly to counter the politicization of the other federal police agencies. So you see divisions within federal law enforcement potentially emerging. I just saw a report today where a guy in the Marines, I don't know exactly who he was or what his rank was. It's just something I just saw briefly a moment ago, where a guy in the Marines has been removed from his position, a Marine officer, for celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk. So apparently within the ranks of the military, you're starting to see these kinds of divisions. And we know that Trump and some of his people and some of the leading military officers have had fallings out as well. So what that means is that there could be forces within the state, including rival factions within the state, that are trying to cultivate these online, cult-like groups, for lack of a better term, and perhaps egg them on and as a means of fueling social divisions or attacking political rivals or something of that nature. And we also can't rule out foreign forces. A lot of my social media audience are Russophiles and fans of the Russians, so they always get mad when I say this. But the Russian intelligence would certainly have a stake in trying to fuel chaos and division within the United States itself, for obvious reasons. A weakened and divided United States would work to their advantage. The Ukrainians, are another group, because the Ukraine war is a divisive issue within the United States. The Ukrainian intelligence has a stake in attacking sectors of American political culture that are opposed to the Ukraine war. We know that the Ukrainians most likely engage in these kinds of activities. For example, they were probably behind the murder of Daria Dugin, and there's no reason why they wouldn't carry out something like that in the United States as well. Also, there's the Israeli intelligence. Some people have speculated that because Charlie Kirk seems to have had something of a falling out with a lot of his pro-Israel donors in more recent times, or he was aggravating pro-Israel forces, both in Israel itself and within the United States, by platforming critics of Israel like Tucker Carlson and Cenk Uygur and some of these kinds of people, that perhaps the Israelis decided that they wanted the youth wing of the political right in the United States to be led by somebody who's more amenable to their own interests, like Ben Shapiro or someone of that nature. So all of these things are a possibility that I think cannot be ruled out. At the same time, in our own culture, we do have these incidents of, seeming lone wolf nutcases that go off and assassinate somebody. That seems to be fairly common in an American culture. We've had at least 4 presidents who were killed by those kinds of figures, at least ostensibly, and assassination attempts on other presidents, most recently Trump. And then we also, in the United States, we've seen quite a few mass shooter incidents. We've seen quite a few serial killer incidents. And while other countries have that kind of thing, it seems to be unusually common in the United States. And I tend to think that leads more towards a cultural analysis than a political one. I think the United States, being a competitive society that's very individualistic and where people are highly mobile, tends to breed a much higher degree of what's the sociologist Emil Durkheim called anomie. For example, Durkheim said that Protestant cultures tended to have a higher suicide rate than Catholic cultures. But the corollary to that is that Protestant cultures historically have also been the ones where capitalism is more deeply entrenched, and where there's also a greater degree of individualism and mobility, and people are less rooted and more cosmopolitan and things like that. And that may have the effect of breeding more pathological personalities who, as some sort of personal catharsis, act out in these kinds of predatory ways. Robert Ressler, who was an FBI investigator that profiled serial killers, that was his theory as to why serial killers tend to be more commonplace in the United States compared to a lot of other cultures, is this kind of anomie that's more endemic to cultures like our own. So all of these factors seem to play into these kinds of circumstances.
Florian.
Yeah. I think there's almost a second argument to be made for the FBI and for other forces to foment violence via indirect means, right? Because they sometimes make a very incompetent impression. So the notion that the FBI would directly egg someone on, or directly that forces within the FBI would directly tell a shooter to do something, maybe not the case, right? Although I'm partly joking here. I think the stochastic terrorism also serves that any foreign power or any domestic power can basically shape a narrative in a certain way, and then somebody takes up the mantle, right? So you put an anti-Russian narrative in there, or you put like a pro-Israel narrative in there, or what have you, right? Or a Ukrainian narrative, and then somebody decides enough is enough, and he starts doing it, right? But I think first of all, to have a foreign actor directly instruct someone to assassinate a high-profile conservative personality. In the case of Charlie Kirk, he was very close to President Trump. I would think if you want to destabilize a country, you do not that actually is more powerful than you. You do not quite want to assassinate people that are directly in the circle of the president, like right? Because that could have geopolitical consequences. Nobody will kill Donald Trump's children for that same reason, I believe. So you know, and for the motive in general, it would fit with someone who is like a very adheres to extreme left wing views. You know, if you have the opinion that Hitler or that Trump is Hitler part two, you will feel at one point that you need to act, right? If you get narratives that trans people are now suffering as a direct consequence from Charlie Kirk moving around the country, then you find in your mind that, okay, I need to act now, because otherwise we will all trans people will all die at the end of this year. So I need to stop this now, right? So that is a motive. That is a motive right there. You also get a ton of support by fellow liberals, right? Basically, so you may feel that here I'm taking one for the team, right? So that could be the motive of the shooter. It doesn't need to be a clear motive. I do this and then this results. It could just be something. Take the overall threat away, and then we can live in peace.
Okay, Alec. Oh, you're muted, Alec. You're still muted. Yeah.
I'm sorry. So the claim that I find to be the most interesting here is the one that Keith made about enemy in Protestant societies. In addition to Emil Durkheim's work on enemy, or sense of being culturally uprooted and bereft of social mores that keep us grounded and anchored, there is a concept of the Protestant ethic. As Keith says, capitalism tends to thrive in Protestant societies, as Max Weber discussed in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Now, with this comes with this, the market forces flourish, but they also create dislocation and chaos. As again, Keith mentioned, Robert Ressler, a famous FBI agent who profiled lone wolf serial killers. That's unfortunately much more common in the U.S. than anywhere else. And we are seeing some corollary between the mass assassins, the mass shooters. Yet there is another nuance to be taken into account. Traditional sociologists have studied how people behaved in groups like churches, political parties, families, and so on, the mainstream institutions. Yet our society has taken the logic of Protestant sectarianism to its vicious extreme. American society is becoming much more individualistic, and not in the sense of trying to create a cult of a self-made man, but more so by way of social isolation, fragmentation, and division that's fomented by social media. And in this day and age, it's important to track how potentially pathological individuals behave online. That is where modern sociology seems to be lacking. That it seems to me that sociologists today still pay a disproportionate amount of attention to traditional institutions, and not enough to where people actually have their collective identities formed. And that is perhaps Discord chats, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. Now young people spend more time online than ever. Many people in Tyler Robinson's age group, they hardly know their neighbors. They barely ever spend time with anybody they may be working with or studying at the university. So if the FBI is to make any real progress in preemptively identifying shooters, they need to collaborate with big tech and sociologists in the extensive study of behavior and social media. And I wonder, could this be done without violating the Fourth Amendment rights? Could people still have their First Amendment rights, the free expression, respected, while the FBI could profile and identify potential shooters? Could this be done without expanding the Patriot Act? Is there any way to truly do this without turning it into a minority report of all sorts and creating a society far more tyrannical than anything George Bush and the supporters of the Patriot Act may have imagined? So is there going to be a compromise between public safety and freedom? Is this starting to look like a Latin American society where there is an obvious distinction between a safe dictatorship and an unsafe democracy? Believe it or not, in Argentina, where I happen to be now, there are still people fondly remembering the dirty war, the Vidal years, when the Argentine junta eliminated at least 10,000 people, possibly 30,000. But that was a time of relative security and stability. And then the previous bloodthirsty dictatorship by Carlos Sangani, which was in the 60s, there was no inflation and there was public safety. Yeah, crime was also quite low. On the other hand, public safety in Argentina has seen better days and inflation is coming down. But again, is this a choice that the American society will have to make? Are we going to allow the big tech to collude with the FBI, not even collaborate, to collude with the FBI to create some kind of a Kafkaesque social credit system that's reminiscent of the Chinese way of profiling people? And is this really what we need in order to prevent these mass shootings from proliferating? I think that this is a fundamental problem in political philosophy that we as a nation will need to confront in the next 10 years. As freedom of speech is declining, freedom in every sense of the word is declining. And I'm wondering, is this going to result in a society that is even less free than it is now? And even more disturbingly, will we see a version of the strategy of tension that we've seen in Greece and Italy in the 60s and 70s? That apparently the Greek military junta staged terrorist attacks to stimulate the demand for a stronger regime, for a stronger state. And the same happened in Italy, where the communists ended up being blamed for terrorist attacks. So some of them were actual false flag operations in Italy that were meant to stimulate the desire for a strong state. So I'm not a 9/11 truther. I don't believe in that. I am skeptical of that conspiracy theory. But if there is ever a time for the government to implement a strategy of tension in a manner that will create opportunities for tyranny far more effective than 9/11 ever did, it is now. And now they have AI and the surveillance tools from the Patriot Act and the NSA to make it happen. So this is deeply troubling.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Alec, that this could be used to create more of a security state than we already have. So moving into the final thoughts and final statements, just look at who benefits, look at, using the principle thing is what a thing does. I think a lot of this is probably is stochastic terrorism. Who's actually doing it? I still have a suspicion that it was a professional who got away. This has all of the earmarks and feelings of somebody who's being pinned, because part of this is sort of like to humiliate the right. It sounds like somebody wants to go after Nick Fuentes because they're blaming him indirectly for all this, which is really weird. Like, why would somebody on the right shoot another right-wing person? That makes no sense. They can't even keep a straight narrative. And the other thing that was really weird is the day that Charlie was shot, when Trump released his video, it was an AI video. You could look at the hands. The hands are all weird. It wasn't even really Trump giving that little 4 minutes of, oh, I miss you, Charlie. So everything's really weird about this. What I'll say is, I feel like we're moving to a new level of consciousness where all the old arguments, all the old ways of looking at things just won't work. And most people are just going to be left behind because they'll be mentally shocked and won't be able to process what's happened. So final thoughts, Keith.
Yeah, well, as far as the Nick Fuentes question, there's actually a rivalry on the right wing between the center right conservatives, like what Charlie Kirk was, and the extreme right that are more white nationalist or anti Jewish or whatever. And a lot of those people really did not like Charlie Kirk. Although there's evidence that Charlie Kirk was also becoming more anti-Israel, and so theoretically he could have been a target by both Zionist and anti-Zionist. So or by white nationalists more generally. So that's I don't know that that's what happened here, but it's a possibility. I've said for some time. In fact, I was on Joseph Cotto's show a couple years ago, I guess, talking about this. But I've thought that for a while, the United States seems to be becoming a synthesis of three things. On one hand, we're becoming more like the European Union, where we're not really a unitary nation as much as a collection of sub-nations and subcultures that is part of an overarching currency union and trade zone and military alliance. Because if you think about, what does it mean to be American today? Well, I mean, yeah, you have American citizenship. There is such thing as being an American citizenship with your American passport. But it means, okay, you're under the rule of the Pentagon. You use the dollar, and we have open trade between Maryland and Virginia and North Carolina. And there's not really a cultural commonality in the same way that there might have been in past times. We're fragmenting more into subcultures and that kind of stuff. To the degree there's a common culture, it's commercial culture, it's McDonald's and all that kind of stuff. So we're becoming more like the European Union. And then I think certainly the liberal wing of the ruling class, the transatlantic capitalist, finance capitalist class, they envision the United States being like the West EU. I think that's really their vision for what the United States, they want the United States to be. And in fact, I think that's why they tend to be much more sympathetic to the Ukrainians. And we're also becoming more like Latin American countries in the sense that we have the kind of wide class divisions, the high levels of violence, at least until recently. Maybe still Latin America has the world's largest rate of violent crime. So we're becoming, and also there's a lot of instability in Latin American countries, a lot of them. So we're becoming more like Latin America with the levels of division, with the levels of internal violence, with the widening wealth gaps, and also just the kind of clown-like, oafish politicians that we often associated with Latin America. We're developing more figures like that here, and also just in terms of sheer policy, like Peter Zeihan has talked about the similarities between, say, Trump and Perón, and then some of our more left-leaning politicians increasingly look like the left Peronist and the pink tide and sectors of Latin American politics as well. And then the third aspect is we're in some ways becoming more like the Middle East, South Asia, or Africa, in the sense we have higher levels of public violence between sectarian or tribal or political groups, as that report that I was flashed on the screen at the beginning of this program showed. If you look over the information, I posted that on Facebook as well. If you look at the information on there, we see all kinds of religiously motivated attacks, politically motivated, racially, ethnically motivated. And that's what you get often in a society where tribal violence between rival sectarian groups is very common. You find that in Africa, you find that in Latin America, you find it in India and other South Asian countries. So we're developing that as well. Now, a big question, I think, is the issue of whether a ruling class faction, because we have a very fragmented ruling class. I'd say the basic divisions are on the so-called left, you've got transatlantic finance capital, and you've got the lower to medium levels of new capital, like the left wing of Silicon Valley and that kind of stuff. And then on the right, you've got the national industrial bourgeoisie, largely based in the Sun Belt, aligned with the military industrial complex. And then you've got the upper levels of new capital, and that's the biggest tech oligarchs and the biggest finance firms like BlackRock, and as well as the Zionist plutocrats that have lurch rightward in defense of Israel, who are really just Israeli nationalists. Right, so that's the major divisions in the ruling class, as I see it, and it's likely that each of these ruling class factions will try to put forward a Bonapartism of their own, because that's what you get when is a highly divided ruling class. The different ruling class factions will try to put forward a Bonapartism that is able to, where you have like a strong man type of system that can flatten out, or differences or suppress differences within not only the society but in the ruling class itself. And I see some people on the right hoping Trump can be that guy. I call Trumpism American Erdoganism with Zionist characteristics, and I could see something like that emerging from another direction as well. I could see more of I don't know that AOC would be the right person for this, but I could see a more left populist type person being weaponized by the neoliberal wing of the ruling class if necessary. So whether that's going to happen or not, we don't know, but could be.
All right, Alec, final thoughts.
Well, Todd, I'm going to respond to something particularly insightful that you said, that we're developing a new level of consciousness through which we understand the world. And that is the succinct of a definition of the fourth Jordan as one can come up with. We're essentially developing a whole new way of looking at society, and a whole new way of defining ourselves in relation to each other and our society by and large. That is to be expected. That is what happened in the 30s and 40s when the traditional laissez-faire models of capitalism were abandoned in favor of something that one may call managed capitalism, managerialism. And we've seen the rise of capitalism, or the rise of the Gilded Age in the 1860s and 1870s. So what are we building this time? I'm quite troubled by what may be emerging. What is emerging is much more authoritarian than what we've seen in the Gilded Age or in the 1950s. Supposedly, the high is what follows the fourth Jordan, an era of relative stability. If that's so, then we may be seeing a sort of a Kafkaesque, Chinese-style, totalitarian way of managing society. And as you mentioned, Todd, that a lot of people are going to be left behind. They will not be able to adjust to this new way of thinking, to this new way of dealing with social media, for example. It's still difficult for sociologists to study human behavior in groups by looking at social media. I have not read a single paper on how, say, Discord or TikTok shapes the group identity of young people than the way the church or family or a political party might. So that's a gaping hole in modern social science research. And given that people are going to be left behind, in line with the bell curve thesis, totalitarianism is almost a foregone conclusion. It has to be, because if these people are not able to blend into society, and they cannot be responsible citizens, well, their rights will have to be taken away. And I'm wondering, is it necessary that America becomes a tyranny just to have a modicum of security? And that's a very serious possibility, because in this country, there are more guns than people. And if we're seeing a proliferation of the mental health crisis and the massive expansion thereof, that is altogether unplaceable and indomitable, it would seem to me that all-out chaos is certainly a serious possibility, and the FBI or the ruling class or the tech oligarchy will act exactly as Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein said they would act. They would form a new cognitive elite, and they would have a rather brusque way of dealing with outsiders and the underachievers. In this case, Murray and Herrnstein were talking about low IQ people. But it seems to me now that there's so much progress, there's so much change going on, that even people with an average IQ can no longer keep up. According to the data that Herrnstein and Murray developed, it seemed that having an average IQ is not so bad. You can have a decent domestic environment, can be a decent parent, you can avoid accidents. So the authors of the bell curve focused mostly on the low IQ people and how the quasi-illiterate mental defectives recall the havoc that now we're seeing. Now we're beginning to see a world where one may need an IQ of 115 just to do the basic things that an IQ of 90 was more than enough in the 1990s. And if that is the case, totalitarianism seems inevitable.
All right, you get the last word, Florian.
All right, yeah, good points. So basically, we're not entirely sure whether this was stochastic terrorism, like an outcome of that, the shooting of Charlie Kirk, whether that was an outcome of stochastic terrorism or whether that was actually a bot hit. All the narratives seem weird overall, and I think it will probably remain weird. We live in a weird way, we live in a weird presence with like strange narratives abounding. And by the way, I mean they found John F. Kennedy's assassin, they found R.F. Kennedy's assassin, and to the day there are still enough people who don't believe that. So that could also play a role. Maybe we will never really find him. Although I think that Tyler Robinson, that story seems to be pretty solid, but who knows? And Keith pointed out something very, very good. There's a competition between center right and American first right, so more like right wing right. The problem I see is that Kirk was a very capable organizer, and he was basically a conciliatory person, right? So what comes after him may not be as conciliatory or efficient in different ways. Like even going so far that saying like Kirk could have been a great president one day, but that seems to be sort of over, right? We won't get someone again who has been with the MAGA movement from the very beginning. He started out during the Tea Party movement, 2011, right? The time is just not there to restart something like that again. The movements are maturing now and are more polarized. It seems impossible that someone like Charlie Kirk would come along again, at least not in the next few years. And this feeds into Keith's notions about like clownish and violent policies or violent actions like we have in South America and the Middle East, right? So Bonapartism seems to be something that is likely to come out of that, which would be sort of like a reconciliatory person as well, but maybe not as nice as Charlie Kirk would have been. And if we take Alexei's points to that, after the chaos of the fourth turning, there will be a period of stability, and now we have all these AI tools. So I think the two central points that I want to bring up as a closing word are really so first of all, like it's interesting, maybe that's just something interesting that we can ponder. If we say the Protestants are more cosmopolitan in nature, the Puritans seem to have been more blood and soil, at least in the beginning when they came here, right? Whereas Catholics had more allegiance toward Europe, right? So in the beginning, Protestants would be not very cosmopolitan, but it could be that after 200 years, now the cosmopolitan aspect comes out more for Protestants. And then the second thing, the question is, should the FBI be more active in Discord service? Well, they already tried that, I believe, using Palantir and other AI software for that. But I think what Alexei said has merit. Certainly, you need to find these people before they become active. But you don't want to have some Minority Report future. And I think what we need to do to avoid that we get into a social credit system, we need to defang the elites that would have an advantage from AI surveillance. I think that's the only way to prevent that future from coming. And maybe the outrage that's felt now on the right wing against people like Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan and the widow of Steve Jobs and so on. So maybe that leads to some RICO action against these people, and maybe that will like push back against them a little bit, so that reduces the danger of living in a social credit like AI surveillance system.
All right. Well, first of all, we have, before we wrap up, this is the highest views we've ever got for a roundtable and one of the all-time highs on the channel, 216. So thanks everybody for tuning in and watching. And just before I wrap up, the link that you see on X, in future, when you see a live stream link and you retweet it, that helps get more views in. So thanks for bringing in the views, guys. Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Florian. Thanks, Alec. This is Todd Lewis of the Parents of Fly podcast signing off.